course, this year really marks the 150th anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That's really was the occasion for the book that Ben Shapell and I compiled. I do, since she's here, I want to also note my good friend Carolyn Hussle, who's just stepped down as the COO of the Jewish Book Council, president of the Jewish Book Council, and who had a great deal to do with this book and my career. So I'm honored to have Carolyn in our midst. Now, as a teenager, I still remember visiting at Jerusalem and being amazed that even there, with the streets named for various Jewish luminaries, Moses Maimonides and the Rambam and the modern Hebrew poet Peretz Spolenskin, there was a sign that reads Abraham Lincoln, or as Israelis seem to know him, Avraham Lincoln. One day in the 1970s, my late father was walking with me on this famous street, on Lincoln Street, and he was curious, so he stopped a passerby on the street, and he inquired in Hebrew, "Who is Abraham Lincoln? What did he do to merit a street in Jerusalem?" The passerby stopped and he looked at the street sign and he thought for a minute, and then his face lit up and he replied sagely, "Oh, he was a prominent Jew in America. He made a large contribution to the United Jewish Appeal." So I'm quite confident that I do not need to identify Abraham Lincoln to this audience, but you may wonder, Abraham Lincoln and the Jews? What's the relationship? How did Ben Shapell and I manage to fill up such a big fat book on this subject? And the answer to that question turns out to reveal a great deal about Lincoln and about America and about the Jewish community of that time. Abraham Lincoln's life actually coincided in many ways with the emergence of Jews on the American scene. When Lincoln was born back in 1809, there were scarcely 3,000 Jews in the whole United States, most of them concentrated in a few East Coast port cities. By the time Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, large-scale immigration, principally from Central Europe, from Poland, from Germany, and so on, had brought the Jewish population of the United States to more than 150,000. And so Lincoln's interactions with Jews form part of a larger story of how America begins to come to terms with its growing Jewish population, and how actually America and Jews were changed by that encounter. Now, growing up in Hardin County, Kentucky, and Spencer County in Indiana, Lincoln probably encountered no living Jews. The only Jews he knew when he was growing up were in the Bible, which of course Abraham Lincoln mastered, thank you so much, and knew thoroughly. He may well have been our most biblically literate president. Now, lots of Americans during Lincoln's boyhood, when they thought of Jews, they thought, oh, let's convert them. They wanted to missionize those who didn't share their faith. That was not true of Lincoln's view growing up. Lincoln's family belonged to a rather small Christian church that believed fatalistically in predestination. Everything had been decided in advance, and that's important, that sense that everything is predestined, because it meant that unlike others at the time, Lincoln never sought to convert or evangelize Jews. He assumed that's just the way God made them. It's not for us to try and change them. Now, as he gets older, certainly by as he gets older, Lincoln encounters Jews. Jews have spread by 1850 from one end of the country all the way out to California. The gold rush has brought Jews to San Francisco, and with the spread of Jews across the country, Lincoln encountered them as so many other Americans did. Overall, by the time of his death, Lincoln had accumulated over 120 friends, associates, supporters, acquaintances, and appointees who turned out to be Jewish. It's really astonishing. I'm sure you can't see that, all the names there, but this is Dina Grossman's remarkable diagram of Lincoln's Jewish connections. If you want to look at it close up, you have to buy a copy of that book, and you can master it. But what's important about it are not the names, so much as the number. No previous president in American history came close to interacting with so many Jews. And the truth is, several presidents, including Lincoln's predecessor, the forgettable James Buchanan, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, were openly prejudiced against Jews. Johnson prided himself in some ways in his anti-Semitism. On the contrary, Lincoln was different. For fully half of his life, he had Jewish friends and acquaintances, and he repeatedly intervened on Jews' behalf. And the fact that he knew Jews probably explains some of the reason why he was different. When you actually know somebody, you're not willing to accept a stereotype about the group. Lincoln came to trust Jews because he knew Jews. Lincoln is especially close to that man, whose name is Abraham Jonas. Abraham Jonas was a Jewish lawyer and politician in Quincy, Illinois. Anybody from Quincy? No? It hasn't grown that much from those days to this day. But Lincoln once described Jonas as one of my most valued friends. There are a series of letters between the two men, and the one that really surprised me was the letter in which Abraham Jonas, who was a master of political strategy, really talks about how the Republican Party, which has just gotten started, can really attract people and gain the presidency, and he helps to craft the strategy of focusing on political outsiders. And they talk about liberals and free-thinking Germans, and then the word that I never expected to see in a letter from that period, and that word was Israelites. So already prior to 1860, Jonas is thinking about a Republican strategy of getting the Jewish vote, we would say. How to attract the Jewish vote. Republicans actually been trying to do that now for 150 years as well. But our friend Jonas here hosted Lincoln. That's the Lincoln-Douglas debates. One of them was held in Quincy. And in 1860, at the Republican National Convention, it was Jonas, this Jewish lawyer, the friend of Lincoln, who crafts the strategy which involved somewhat packing the hall in Chicago, and that meant that William Seward, who also tried to pack the hall, did not gain the nomination on the first ballot. And just as Abraham Lincoln imagined, when Seward didn't gain the nomination on the first ballot, a lot of people turned to Abraham Lincoln, who won on the third ballot. Now, following Lincoln's election, Jonas, who had children in the South, sent him a private letter, marked in big letters, confidential, and in that letter, he warns Lincoln of an assassination plot aiming to disrupt the inauguration. He urged Lincoln to take precautionary measures, and as many of you know, Lincoln did. He tried to sneak in to Washington at 3 in the morning, rather than the original plan, in part because of these warnings of a plot against him. And in gratitude, Abraham Lincoln's first Jewish appointment after he becomes president was this friend, Abraham Jonas, who was appointed postmaster in Quincy. You have to remember that in the middle of the 19th century, that was a very lucrative patronage position, which he gave to his friend. And when Abraham Jonas died during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln did something even more unusual. As if it's not unusual enough to appoint a Jew, he then appointed Mrs. Jonas to be what they called in those days postmistress of Quincy. She, in other words, inherited it from her husband. Her name was Louisa. Now, Lincoln made many more appointments with the onset of the war, and some of them were Jews, although it's not always clear that Lincoln knew they were Jewish. After all, most people appointed simply on the basis of their merit. But remarkably, this is one of the most remarkable letters from that time. On November the 4th, 1862, Lincoln appointed a New York Jew named Benjamin to a military position, and he does so specifically because we have not yet appointed a Hebrew. You can see that in the front. I believe we have not yet appointed a Hebrew. Actually, he had appointed Hebrews. He didn't know about it. But this is probably the first case of affirmative action involving Jews in all of American history. I love this letter because it also gives you a hint at Lincoln's famous wordplay. We know something about Chemi Levy, who he's appointing. Levy was the son-in-law of Rabbi Morris Raphael of B'nai Jeshurun in New York, which today is known as BJ. And what distinguished Levy, and the reason Lincoln is so interested, is that Levy was an Orthodox Jew. He was a public Jew, a visible Jew. And with that in mind, we can understand what Lincoln is saying, that he is vouched as a capable and faithful man. That word faithful, with typical Lincoln wordplay, carries double meaning. Faithful to the Union and faithful to Judaism. And Lincoln, as you can see, appoints Henry Levy, who's sometimes known as Sherry Levy, as assistant quartermaster with the rank of captain. Now, Lincoln made a much more important appointment of a Jew at that time, and this one changed American history, really, to our very day. Lincoln appointed the very first Jewish military chaplain. We didn't really have military chaplains in America prior to the Civil War, but when Congress votes money for an army in 1861, they make provisions for the chaplaincy, which they restricted to regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination. And that wasn't just a series of words, because when this man, his name was Arnold Fischel, he was the assistant rabbi of Sheriff Israel. Sheriff Israel is the name of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York. It still exists. When Rabbi Fischel, who probably wasn't ordained, but certainly had a great deal of learning and experience, was elected to serve as chaplain by a Jewish-led regiment, the Secretary of War had to turn him down. The Secretary of War, his name was Simon Cameron, wrote, "You are respectfully informed that the chaplain must be a regularly ordained minister of some Christian denomination. Had it not been for this legal impediment, the department would have taken your application into its favorable consideration." So, here for the first time we see Jews relegated to being second-class citizens, and in a way Judaism is a second-class religion. Christians can be chaplains, Jews cannot be chaplains. And the question is what to do. Should you say, well, it's wartime, let's not rock the boat? Or do you say, we're fighting for a set of principles? Clearly, one of the principles is that Jews are equals in this land. So, Fischel, with the Jewish community, resolves the fight for Jewish equality, and at the behest of the Jewish community, he takes his case directly to Abraham Lincoln in the White House. And he actually left us a log report, which still exists in his handwriting, at the American Jewish Historical Society. He reports that he came to the White House, and actually it was a bit like in the Spielberg film. All sorts of people were milling around, waiting to see the president. And lo and behold, Lincoln invited Fischel in ahead of all sorts of other people. And Fischel reports, the president fully admitted the justice of my remarks and agreed that something ought to be done. And we know that Lincoln, using his superb political skills, that also comes through in the Spielberg film, Lincoln crafted an amendment to change that discriminatory law. Basically, he construed the word Christian to mean religious, and he then buried the law, changing the chaplaincy deep in a bill to increase the pay of popular generals. Nobody votes against increasing the pay of popular generals, and that's how this amendment got passed. And then Lincoln did something even more important. He actually appointed a Jewish chaplain. The man's name was Jacob Frankel. In other words, not only did he change the law, but in a way he change the facts on the ground. And at that moment, our world was changed, because that meant that non-Christians of all sorts could serve as military chaplains, which of course they still do to this day. So today, when there are Buddhist chaplains and Muslim chaplains and Wiccan chaplains and so on, they don't realize it, but it all goes back to this moment in 1862 when Jews fought for the right for there to be a Jew as a military chaplain, and Abraham Lincoln supported their battle. Now, 2 days after he appointed Jacob Frankel, on September the 20th, 1862, Lincoln met another Jew who would become important to him, and that Jew's name, not a very good picture, was Issachar Zachary. I'm going to have much more to say about Issachar Zachary as being a kind of mystery man. One historian called him Abraham Lincoln's most enigmatic intimate. I would like to be called an enigmatic intimate, but in any case, I'll have more to say about him in the second session I give at I think 4:45. But let me just say that this Zachary was a chiropodist. That's the old word for a podiatrist, a foot doctor. Foot doctors were quiet. Foot problems were very common in the 19th century because most people had ill-footing feet. It's really only in the 20th century that we have the kind of shoes, right shoe, left shoe, with all of the measurements. So you can do an experiment, put your left shoe on your right foot and vice versa. You all need a chiropodist too. And our friend Zachary here was tremendously skilled at curing feet problems, and he acquired hundreds of testimonials to prove it. I will share one with you. I'll perhaps show more later. But this is one of my favorite testimonials. He went to the White House. He helped Abraham Lincoln, who is made of famously painful feet. This would be disputed as to why his feet were so painful. For that to be a professor of medicine. But Zachary helped to cure his feet. And the first time he met with Lincoln, Lincoln writes this note about Zachary, and it's vintage Lincoln. We were talking earlier about character. Lincoln only writes the truth, and it's fascinating. Dr. Zachary has, with great dexterity, taken some troublesome corns from my toe. He is now healing me, and I believe with success for what lame people call backache. We shall see how it will end. So, no, this is vintage Lincoln. It's brief, it's to the point. Lincoln associates himself with the plain people, and it is honest to a fault. I write lots of recommendations for my students. I have to admit, I would never write, oh, this student has been quite a good student. How he will end, we will see, or something like that. The student would never get a job. If I wrote, we shall see how it will end. But Lincoln, he wasn't called honest Abe for nothing. He was very careful in crafting his words, and he doesn't tell us more than he can prove. It must have ended well, by the way, because Lincoln and Zachary meet on multiple occasions. There's another note from Lincoln, and eventually, this Zachary, as I'll say more later, is actually sent by Lincoln to New Orleans on a secret mission. While he's there, he does a lot of work for Jews, which nobody knew before, and still later. Anybody here from New Orleans? And still later, in 1864, Zachary works to help re-elect Abraham Lincoln. And as you may remember, Abraham Lincoln wasn't sure that he would gain the election. Today we know he won by a landslide, but that had something to do with victories just prior to the election. In any case, Zachary works very hard to get the Jews to vote for Lincoln. This is the earliest example I know of organized efforts to get out the Jewish vote in an American presidential election. Now, Jews actually had lots of reasons to vote for Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Not only had he appointed Jews to office and changed the chaplaincy laws, but in late 1862, he had refused to heed anti-Semites who blamed Jews for wartime smuggling, and I once spoke about this here, he unhesitatingly overturned Ulysses S. Grant's order expelling Jews as a class from his war zone. To condemn a class, President Lincoln explained, and it's still a good line. I wish that Spielberg had included this line in his film. To condemn a class is, to say the least, to rob the good with the bad. I do not like to hear a class or nationality condemned, Lincoln said, on account of a few sinners. Very important and timeless lesson that he taught. Another thing that Lincoln does that Jews are very grateful for is that he shifts his rhetoric to take account of the presence of Jews in America. Until Lincoln, and even in the early presidency of Abraham Lincoln, you can see Lincoln talking about America as if everybody in America was Christian. Christian country, Christian people, and so on. But Jews are unhappy with that. And then, of course, at the Battle of Gettysburg, it becomes known. Jews fell side by side with Christians. There were quite a number of Jews who played a role in the terrible Battle of Gettysburg. And that's why, I think, in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln goes out of his way to use language that is inclusive. Those of you who know the Gettysburg Address know that he does not call America a Christian nation. Instead, he uses a new term, not previously used in American political rhetoric, but much used afterwards, and that term is this nation under God. And of course, that's a term that is inclusive of Jews and Christians, and that's a new phrase. And similarly, in his second inaugural, which really merits rereading, it's a remarkable address, a sermon really, but not a Christological sermon. Again, Lincoln mentions no particular religion. He addresses people of all faiths, Jews among them. So again, this sets a pattern. America is a more inclusive country today, thanks in part to Lincoln's words and actions. Now, of course, his willingness to embrace Jews is parallel to much better known efforts to abolish slavery, to grant equality to Black Americans, and we know that Lincoln actually viewed, as many Americans did, viewed blacks and Jews in somewhat parallel ways at that time as persecuted peoples whose lot needed to be improved. And there's a very curious character, a religious enthusiast named Henry Wentworth Monk. There he is. And he goes to the White House and meets with Abraham Lincoln, and he urges Lincoln to follow the emancipation of the Negro by a still more urgent step, the emancipation of the Jew. To Lincoln, I think the connection between eradicating the persecution of blacks and ending the persecution of Jews must have seemed obvious, and really it's the belief that he had in human equality. Now, Lincoln's last week of life was closely and actually almost eerily connected with Jewish life, and very few people realize the close connection between the last week of the Civil War and the Jewish calendar. Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, which is really the demise of slavery, occurred just one day before Jews sat down to observe the Passover Seder. And this is not just me as a historian recognizing that coincidence, it was recognized at the time. So, for example, the Daily Advertiser in Boston pointed to the coincidence that the modern people of bondage, meaning Southern slaves, had seen their deliverance confirmed and nearly consummated about the same season of the year as Passover. And then a couple of days later, when Jews are sitting down to the second Seder, Abraham Lincoln delivered what turned out to be his last public address. The subject of that address was post-war Reconstruction, and the speech included Lincoln's most explicit statement on black suffrage. You remember he said that at least the very intelligent should be given the elective franchise, and especially those who were serving in the ranks as soldiers. Well, in the audience for that speech was this man. He's very handsome. That's John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth's father, by the way, imagined himself to be of Jewish descent from Spain. There's no evidence that it's true, but even there's an interesting connection. In any case, John Wilkes Booth heard that address on the second night of Passover. He was appalled. Freedom, ex-slaves, suffrage for ex-slaves, and he decided that that would be the last speech that Abraham Lincoln would ever deliver. That Friday night for Jews was the start of Shabbat, and the fifth day of Passover is what we call Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. Many Jews settled down to a special holiday dinner. Abraham Lincoln and his wife, of course, along with two guests, famously traveled to Ford's Theater. And everybody knows what happened next. All the books on Lincoln essentially end with a bang. I want to show you that picture because it's little known that one of the men who attended Lincoln after he was shot, right there in the middle, with a little beard, and that's Dr. Lieberman. He was a very significant surgeon and head of the Medical Society in Washington. Obviously, he couldn't do anything, but note the central position that he played. This is Alonzo Chaco's famous painting of Lincoln's deathbed. By the way, those of you who've been here in Washington, you can go to that room. Notice how small the room is and how large it looks in this painting. Many more people claim to be with Lincoln on that last night than could possibly have fit into that little room, which is still accessible. But Dr. Lieberman was undoubtedly there. We have a little time, so let me let me bring to your attention something quite interesting, because in addition to being the 150th anniversary of the assassination of Lincoln, it is also the 150th anniversary of the only painting of Abraham Lincoln that was painted by a Jew, by this man, Solomon Nunez Carvalho. He was a Sephardic Jew, born in Charleston. He was a quite famous Sephardic family. Carvalho had already demonstrated his skill as a painter. Some of you will know that. That's a painting of Congregation Beth Elohim of Charleston. The reason that's so remarkable is that Carvalho painted it from memory after Beth Elohim burned down in 1838. This was his tribute to it, and we only know what it looks like thanks to that painting, which he did when he was all of 23. Carvalho similarly accompanied the great explorer John Fremont when he went to the West and he took many photographs of the West. Fremont went west and also published a very interesting book on his travels. He's the only Jew who leaves us a book of travels as he goes to the West, incidents of travel and adventure in the far West. And you can see, if you read it carefully, that he was conscious of Kashrut. In terms of what, that's not to say when they were starting, he didn't eat things, but he's conscious of the problem, if you read the book carefully. In any case, Fremont was trying to find a route for the transcontinental railroad. Most of the photographs that Carvalho took are unfortunately lost. If you find any in your attic, they'd be worth a fortune. But then Carvalho moves to New York. He becomes a portraitist. Here's his famous portrait of Isaac Leeser, the most important traditional Jewish leader of the 19th century, and the editor of the Occident. And then in 1865, Carvalho paints this portrait of Abraham Lincoln. There is a machloket, a dispute among the scholars whether he painted it just before Lincoln was assassinated or just after, or I actually think it may be some of both, that it was started before and then finished after. But what's fascinating here, you see Lincoln is holding a scroll. That scroll, I can't get it closer, but that scroll has words for the second inaugural. You know these words. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Those are Lincoln's most famous words, but the interesting thing is, those were not so famous in 1865. Only later did the second inaugural achieve that status. Similarly with that, in the background you can see a statue of George Washington looking on with approval, so to speak, at Lincoln. And there to the right is the ancient Greek cynic philosopher Diogenes. Diogenes in Greek mythology is carrying a lamp in daylight, searching for a truly honest man. And what you see there is he's dropped his lamp in shocked amazement. He's finally found an honest man, honest Abe. So there are many interesting things in this portrait. It's really the first time we see the second inaugural highlighted in that way, a line many of us I'm sure know, but wasn't known then. The linking of Washington and Lincoln. I still remember when it was in February, Lincoln's birthday, Washington's birthday, linked in the popular mind. And here we see that linkage of Washington and Lincoln, which again is only just beginning at that time. The idea of honest aid actually goes back to the first campaign. Here we go. In Lincoln's first campaign, we have the idea, there's Diogenes again, of honest aid. That's a picture by Alexander Hessler in 1860. You know how, anybody know why I say that precedes 1860? That's right, Lincoln doesn't have a beard. And you can always date Lincoln by whether he had a beard or not. He grows that beard for the inauguration, and his letter, the girl told him that he looked more handsome if he grew a beard and he listened. But in any case, this is 1860 campaign poster with the same idea of Diogenes finding an honest person. After the assassination, that theme was morphed into a crying Diogenes, and there's a much later Lincoln, but actually this is a much finer portrait, and really, as I said, anticipates many of the themes that we take for granted. The hearing of Lincoln and Washington, the exaltation of the second inaugural, and Sarna speaks on Carvalho's sense of loss, just as he painted the Charleston Synagogue after it was lost, so he paints Lincoln in that way. And that painting serves as a timely reminder that Jews form an integral part of the history of the United States. Even if almost nobody in this room have ancestors living in the United States in the time of the Civil War, those Jews who were here at that time, Carvalho and Abraham Jonas and Issachar Zachary and 150,000 others, they participated actively in the history of their time. It's crucial, I think, to remember that American history is not just somebody else's history. Contemporary Jews need to own that history as well. And this painting and my book form part of that effort. Thanks very much.